The real Achilles heel of Russia, despite its ability to continue a protracted conflict, is the dire state of its economy. When you look at the currency, you look at interest rates, and then you think about the structure, how its economy has fundamentally been rewired to do nothing but be a larger version of North Korea and Europe, to wage successive campaigns, increasingly through missile salvos targeting Ukraine. I think there is the ability to play with fire and a couple of levers. One is you actually have to expand the scope of sanctions to go secondary sanctions that actually hit financial transactions that deal with Russian hydrocarbon products. Now, if you do that, you're going to have to keep Europe on board. You're also going to have some uncomfortable allies, because ultimately what you want to do is make Russian oil more expensive, Russian gas more expensive, and that actually hurts them, meaning it costs them more to produce, and they don't get as much of the return on their investments. And that's actually really important, because we already see, you mentioned earlier in your show today, we already have oil prices are down over 1% today. So if we have a natural dampening on oil prices at the same time that we have a more concerted sanctions package, we can at least squeeze the ability of Vladimir Putin to wage war. Now, to be fair, that's still going to take time to actually impact his battlefield performance, given that he's got consistent support from both China and Iran and has found ways to kind of turn on the Russian economy into a war economy.
Hey, Ben, it's great to have you back. Let's talk about his battlefield performance, because last time you were with us, you showed us your Russian firepower strike tracker, which people can Google and look at this online, which shows us a massive increase in missile attacks by Vladimir Putin, the daily tally of Russian missile attacks since Donald Trump has become president. Is he trying to seize on a closing window to do as much damage as possible before there's a peace deal, or it's just open season under Trump?
So I don't think it has as much to do with the Trump presidency as much as Vladimir Putin's perspective on how you negotiate from a position of strength. And that is sadly to hold the Ukrainian population hostage. And as you mentioned, the firepower strike tracker, let me break down what we saw in the last 72 hours, because the numbers are stark. In the last 72 hours, we had 355 Shahed attacks. That's the largest in a 72-hour period since the war began. And we're still 70 of those weapons got through. When I say 70, to put that in perspective, that means over 7,000 pounds of high explosives hit Ukrainian cities in the last 72 hours just with Shahed drones. And it wasn't just Shaheds. There were 23 ballistic missiles fired in this period. Now, normally, you only see 1 to 2 ballistic missiles fired per day. So 23 in a 72-hour period is a massive increase. And you also saw 62 cruise missile attacks. Now, when you put that all together, that means you have over 1,000 one-way attack drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles that were largely targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure, civilian populations, and political centers of gravity, almost as if it was a slight to our president and anyone who thinks that Putin isn't in this war for the long haul and going to try to settle this on the battlefield, or at least seeing if he can break the will of the Ukrainian people during this kind of pseudo-negotiation period we're in.
So, Ben, are you saying that this is more about the psychological impact of these strikes than actual territorial advances Russia is trying to make?
That's a great question. And yes, I do think that. In fact, as part of that firepower strike tracker, we've done 2 recent studies. One study called drone saturation, which really looks at the profile of the Shahed attacks. But to your question, the more important one is called operational fires in an age of punishment. And what we statistically prove in that is that Russia has decoupled its strategic attack forces, its ballistic missiles, its cruise missiles, its Shahed drones, from its operational level battlefield objectives. Meaning in modern war, when you have precision strike, we would expect to see a tighter coupling of these deep fires with operational ground maneuvers. And we statistically can show in that report that nothing could be further from the truth. It appears to be that like Shahed, so those attack drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles are literally used as a psychological tool, which is a throwback to theories of air power we haven't seen since before the Second World War, where bombing to win meant directly a psychological effect upon the population to then convince leaders to sue for peace. So I think you're onto something. This is more about psychology. It's a coercive campaign. It's a punishment campaign. It has very little modern traditional military utility or logic. It's a throwback to almost a time long gone by.
Well, clearly you're onto something here, Ben, and at the risk of asking the dumb question here alongside Kaylee Lyons, how do you know all of this? Is this based on satellite imagery? You're speaking like you're on the ground in Moscow.
Well, I'd probably be put in jail if I was there. So a New Year's resolution, don't go to jail this year. No, most of this comes from math. It's not magic. One of the fascinating things about war in the information age, when everything is counted and tracked, is if you take time to use basic data science, which your listeners and viewers know well. I mean, everyone who has a Bloomberg terminal has been doing this for decades. It's using data patterns that you find to statistically isolate key patterns and trends. And in this case, that means we can analyze how Russia attacks Ukraine on a daily basis and test a series of hypotheses and really isolate where we find particularly interesting correlations. And in this case, the major correlation we found in that operational fires in the age of punishment was that decoupling of what we would call operational art or large-scale campaign ground maneuver. So when combined arms armies target parts of the Ukrainian front from these deep missile attacks. And that runs contrary to what we've seen in the modern history of war and does look a lot more like theorists like Duhay, who wrote theories of air power really before World War II.
Ben, you spoke a moment ago about Russia's ability to continue to do this because of the support it's still receiving from China and Iran. Is that indefinite? Can it keep up this pace in perpetuity, or will even the flow of support from those adversaries not be able to keep pace with this kind of strike concentration we're seeing like this?
Yeah, you're asking the critical question, because every time economists have believed the Russian economy was about to fail, it holds on for just another day. It's as if suffering is becoming a way of life. So in some sense, Russia has already converted its economy to look more like North Korea than Germany, and I don't think that's going to stop when this war ends. So the real answer to that question becomes the resiliency of that war economy. Now, again, the numbers are telling. If we compare the volume of Shahed, these one-way attack drones, and we know that Russia built its own domestic manufacturing, so it no longer imports them purely from Iran. It basically builds the drone. Sadly, it still smuggles in electronics from around the world to guide these drones. We've seen a 10 times increase. Now, think about that for a second. In the space of a year, despite sanctions, despite a high interest rates, despite a low currency, despite every negative economic indicator you could think of, Russia has still managed to increase its production of Shahed drones by 10 times. The Department of Defense, Secretary Hegseth, would, literally probably hug any defense manufacturer who could promise that degree of scalability.